So, welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm Professor of History here at USC, and I'm the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. We are delighted to have a very intriguing presentation for you today. Before I introduce my speakers, I just want to announce that today the Shoah Foundation has kind of open doors for public visits. So if anybody of the students is interested to go over there, it's in Levy Library, 4th floor, and there are tours, I think, at 2, 3, and 4.
Just 2 and 3.
Oh, 2 and 3, I'm sorry. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer, who together will kind of present on the topic you can see on the screen. Marianne Hirsch is well known in the field. She received her PhD in comparative literature at Brown University and is currently the William Peterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature and Professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality at Columbia University, New York. She has many accolades. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a former president of the Modern Language Association of America. Her focus is on her research focus and writing is on the transmission of memories of violence across generations. And she is well known because she authored and co-authored a number of very influential books, especially Family Frames, Photography, Narrative and Post-Memory, 1997, and The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing and Visual Culture After the Holocaust in 2012. These are, I think, post-memory, this is what Marianne Hirsch is kind of a household name. She coined this term, and so this is a pleasure to have you here. She recently co-edited a volume also on women mobilizing memory. She is a recipient of various fellowships, again, a illustrious list of very prestigious fellowships and awards like the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Humanities Center and the Bellagio and Bogliasco Foundations in Italy. She has served a lot in various functions for the university community at the ACLA Advisory Board, the Board of Supervisors of the English Institute, and the Executive Board of the Society for the Study of Narrative Literature. And these are only a few, so I don't want to take up too much time here. And now I have to find. Sorry about this. Now we're coming to the partner in crime, Leo Spitzer. He received his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin and is now the K.T. Vernon Professor of History Emeritus and Research Professor at Dartmouth College. He writes about individual and collective responses to colonialism and exclusion, Jewish refugee memory, trauma, and also transmission. His books include Lives in Between, The Experience of Marginality in a Century of Emancipation, 1990. He co-edited Acts of Memory, Cultural Recall in the Present, 1999. And I say this on a personal note, most important to me was Hotel Bolivia, The Culture of Memory in the Refuge of Nazism in 1998. Not that I have also a personal connection to Bolivia, but this is one of my favorite books about immigration, kind of triggered by the Holocaust. And he kind of connects family history with a larger kind of trajectory on forced immigration. Leo Spitzer and Marianne Hirsch have also 2 books which they co-authored, Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Chernowitz in Jewish Memory, 2010. And then the book, why they are here for now, which they present here, School Photos in Liquid Time, Reframing Difference. And if you are interested and even triggered after the talk, I think we have kind of flyers out where you can get even a discount. So take advantage. It's my big pleasure to welcome Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer. Give them a warm hand.
Thank you so much, Wolf, for this lovely introduction and the invitation and the chance to speak to you today. It's a pleasure to be here. When the Trump administration announced this past June that it was planning to use an army base in Fort Sill, Oklahoma as a detention center for 1,400 migrant children arriving unaccompanied on the U.S. southern border, the outcry was immediate. The media was quick to point out the history of this site. Fort Sill had been briefly used in 1942 to incarcerate approximately 700 United States residents of Japanese origin as a possible fifth column front from Japan, despite the fact that charges against them were utterly unsupported. When one inmate was shot trying to escape, the internees were quickly moved to another so-called internment camp, one of 10 in the western and central interior of the U.S. I'm sure you all know this history, the history of these camps, which were surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by armed soldiers in watchtowers, and which came to hold 120,000 Japanese Americans, about 80,000 of whom were U.S. citizens who had been forcibly removed from their homes after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and following President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, which was issued in February 1942. But Fort Sill had a prior history of incarceration of populations the U.S. deemed other, undesirable, and threatening. First established in 1869 as a fortified base for U.S. soldiers during the American Indian Wars, it came to hold over 300 Chiricahua Apache prisoners of war with their families who had been forcibly removed from their lands in the Southwest between the 1890s and the early 1900s. Among the imprisoned was Geronimo, the legendary Apache warrior and chief, as well as numerous women and children. When she heard about the Trump administration's planned incarceration of refugee children at Fort Sill, and recalling its notoriety as a place of incarceration, Brenda Lozano, who is the program development coordinator of an organization called Dream Action Oklahoma, stated, quote, "We will not allow history to repeat itself with a concentration camp for immigrant children. Generations of Native American, Japanese, and Black people have been hurt at Fort Sill." Although protests against child detention had been multiplying throughout this past year, this convergence of cruel histories in one particular site occasioned a broader and more effective circle of solidarity. Historical memory mobilized former Japanese American prisoners and their descendants to protest at Fort Sill and other former sites of Japanese American incarceration, deepening awareness of previous periods of U.S. injustice to migrant and minority populations. In this case, the mounting general outcry may have had some effect. The government's plan to use Fort Sill as a detention camp for children was abandoned. Not sure why or whether this had anything to do with it, but possibly it did. Nonetheless, by the end of September of 2019, over 1 million asylum seekers had been taken into custody by U.S. Border Patrol, and refugee children continue to be incarcerated separately from their parents in numerous facilities across the southern United States. It's estimated that in 2019, 70,000 such children were separated from their parents and incarcerated. And children who arrive unaccompanied are called UACs, unaccompanied alien children. What is more, existing detention facilities have been blanketed by a virtually airtight news and photography blackout. Hidden behind tall fences topped by barbed wire, they've been proclaimed off limits to the news media and the general public, including members of Congress. Even when brief visits are allowed, the directive is no cameras, no questions. How many of you have seen any images from inside any of these detention centers? I don't think you have. We haven't, right? What are they afraid of? Asked Representative Julian Castro after such a heavily monitored visit. I mean, he was able to go, but didn't see much. Indeed, what would the public see if lawmakers and the media were allowed in and photography was allowed? And what would the ability to see and thus haptically also to feel the conditions in these camps, what would photographs do in this case? Certainly, interdictions against photography have a long history in repressive and, I would say, authoritarian regimes such as ours is coming to be. So what we'd like to do today is to try to understand the power of photographic images, both to reveal and also conversely to obscure the injustices of forced removal and incarceration of children. And in order to do so, what we want to do is to consider several other examples besides this one of children kept in detention today. Cases where, despite similar interdictions, photography continued as an important and revelatory visual practice, even though what these photographs reveal is contradictory, multiple and contradictory, and hard actually to sort out. So what we want to do is draw on our recently published book, School Photos in Liquid Time, Reframing Difference, in order to look at, in particular, at the genre of school photography in 3 different instances involving child incarceration. Photos taken at government-controlled boarding schools into which Native American children were forcibly removed in the U.S. starting in the 1870s. Photos taken often surreptitiously and clandestinely in school classes held in the Nazi ghettos during the Second World War. And school photos made in concentration camp for Japanese Americans in the United States during the same period in the early 1940s. Focusing on these 3 instances, what we want to do is to examine what school photos taken in such troubled times can tell us about the role of photography in shaping the social institutions of modernity. What do they reveal about ideologies of assimilationism and practices of inclusion and exclusions of multiply diverse population? How do political regimes and social institutions use and misuse photography to further their own missions? And how can the subjects of these images, children and young adults, exercise some control over their representation? How do they envision resistance? Like all photographs, school photographs do more than document the event of their production. Usually they generate a sense of a future in which they will be looked at by the photographed subjects and by their descendants and others interested in the history that they tell. They thus oftentimes serve as memorial objects, measuring time, progress, and survival, loss, and continuity. But class pictures taken in times of extremity, such as the ones we want to discuss today, show us that in their future, they can also serve as documents of injustice and accusation, objects to be mobilized for action toward justice and repair, as we have seen in the protest photos against the incarceration at Fort Sill. Images of children who may not survive to look back at them as adults inhabit what we think of as a liquid temporality, and that's the title, our title, Liquid Time. And I want to just spend a moment trying to present how we came up with this idea. The idea of liquid time was inspired by the artist Jeff Wall's essay, Photography and Liquid Intelligence. It's a very short 3-page essay, but it's really it was very interesting for us. And the idea derives from the process for analog photographs and traces the shift of the analog to the digital. In the darkroom, where this procedure normally takes place, both the camera's film and the photosensitive paper into which the film's image is subsequently projected are immersed and developed in a liquid solution, as all of you who've done that know. Until they are chemically fixed into permanence, they change and transform in subtle and unexpected ways. So when you're in the darkroom and you're waiting for the image to emerge, you don't exactly know what will happen. You're hoping it's what you took the photo of, but maybe not, and things can shift, and it's very mutable. So when Wall wrote this essay in the late 1980s, he wanted to mark the beginning of the digital turn in photography, which introduced a different technological and temporal regime from the analog one, affecting, as he argues, a new displacement of water in photography. But Wall also wanted to complicate the pervasive view of photography as an inexorable apparatus, as a tool of ideological power and domination, embodying a dry and thus unalterable optical and technological intelligence. In highlighting the photograph's liquid intelligence, its potential for mutability instead, he revealed its connection to nature and to water, and thus the contingencies, the affective registers, the possibility for change in the photographic image-making process. Over time, we might say, photographs keep developing. They keep developing in unforeseen directions when they're viewed and reviewed by different people in different presents. In liquid time, they're not fixed into static permanence. Rather, they remain dynamic, unfixed. They acquire new meaning in new circumstances. And one of the things we do in our book is we look at ways that contemporary artists reframe archival images, placing them into new constellations of meaning. Thus, and this actually is to us a way of embodying liquid temporality. But the other thing that contemporary artists do is to show us how we might go back to original images and read them in a different way. They reveal qualities of photography or of archival images that we might not really know how to read. So we use the work of artists like Christian Boltanski here, like Lori Novak, a wonderful artist who's actually in the audience today. We use them to teach us how to go back to the images and look at them in new ways. And just one more example, Carrie Mae Weems, the Hampton Project, and what we've done here very briefly is just to show you the original archival images and then the shifts that they've undergone in the work of these artists, thus illuminating the process of liquid temporality.
So, what may be the first photograph of American Indian school children, of Tulalip children together with their Catholic missionary schoolmasters, was taken around 1865, early in the history of reproducible photography in North America. Made in the American Northwest, in the territory that in 1889 would be incorporated into the US as the state of Washington, this photograph provides one of the earliest examples of what would become a perversive ideological application of the institutional camera gaze. The use of photography, the use of school photos to display the conversion and cultural transformation of indigenous children to the hegemonic white Euro-American mainstream and to its beliefs. Coinciding with the rise of culturally chauvinistic ideologies of social assimilationism in different imperial centers around the world in the latter part of the 19th century, school photos were used to testify and to advertise the successes of acculturation and of socialization of colonized and minority populations. In the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Anglo-American and Anglo-European dominated colonial settlements, societies that expanded their territorial frontiers through conquest of indigenous and aboriginal populations, numerous native children were taken from their families and communities and sent to boarding and missionary schools, often hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. Once there, officials stripped the children of their cultural customs, of their religion, at least tried to, of their languages, and oftentimes their names, in exchange for those of the dominant whites. Photography played an important role in such boarding schools, in the transformation of children into national subjects and in disguising the perpetuation of social inequalities. Kill the Indian and save the man. These are the well-known words used in a lecture and article by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was the founding superintendent of the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who only a few years earlier had participated in the wars that dispossessed Native Americans from the lands of the Southern Plains. The Carlisle Indian School was the first of many boarding schools set up for the education of Native American children after the American Indian Wars and the launching of the reservation system. Captain Pratt and Hollisburg Frissell, who was the founding superintendent of the Hampton Institute in Virginia, which was chartered and was termed the civilizing betterment of Black American youth after the Civil War and after the emancipation from slavery. Both he and Frissell were keenly aware of the powerful publicizing role that photography could play to win political and financial support for the culturally transformative goals of their institutions. They engaged well-known professional photographers of the time, persons like Frances Benjamin Johnson, who became the most famous female photographer in Washington, Nicholas Choate, and they engaged them to stage and to publicize through photography the successes of their mission. That is, they intended to achieve this by using these photographs to influence important people, to support the schools, to influence people to give ransom. And Frances Johnson, for example, was so successful in her photos, if you look at them, some of them are so technically beautiful, that they were used to represent, or in the American pavilions in the 1900 World Fair that was held in Paris, to show the kind of success of, at that point, American race relations. That very, very blatantly used in these purposes. What was called before, or called before and after images, which were already common in other medical contexts, such as medicine and so on and so forth, became a privileged form of evidence in the photos that were taken. Though one might well ask, evidence of what exactly? Now, Captain Pratt wrote a U.S. congressman in the 1880s, and I quote, "I send you today a few stereo views," they use stereo photography, "of the Indian youth here. You will note that they came mostly as blanket Indians, wearing their indigenous clothes. A very large proportion of them have never been inside a schoolroom. I'm gratified to report that they have yielded gracefully to discipline. Isolated as these Indian youth are from the savage surroundings of their homes, they lose their tenacity to savage life, and they give themselves up to learning." So before and after implies a kind of linear narrative of progress, of change, and thus of erasure. But the images, the before and after images, do not show what we can read or hear when we listen, the voices of the depicted students, to their accounts of the events, of their experiences, of the cruelty and trauma that they had to endure in the so-called transformative act, that they suffered. For example, when children came to these schools, their hair, indigenous children, was forcibly cut. That was one of the first acts. Their indigenous clothing was taken, they were forced to wear uniforms. So it was a real effort to transform them. They were given randomly new names, and they were severely, severely punished if they spoke indigenous languages instead of English. So the transformation that occurs in this before and after, and how that was informed, that transformation, through violence, through beatings, through punishments, all of that, of course, does not appear in a before and after image. Things that happen, of course, also in these classes, and that were not shown in before and after, is that in the institutions, in the writing that and the accounts that children left behind about their experiences. The other thing that occurs, however, that was not in the, visible in the before and after, is that in these institutions also, very often a kind of pan-Indian cultural identity began to develop as people began to talk to other people from different regions, from different tribal groups, and so on and so forth. And you began to develop a kind of possibility for a new formation. And that is also not visible in here. A picture that's up there now, which is called Class in American History. And this was taken by Francis Johnson at Hampton Institute. It provides a very good example of how these photos functioned and whom they served. Visually, it relegates the violent reality of American expansionism and its so-called civilizing mission to a background prop. In the background, and you might, I don't know how easily you can see it, there is a picture in the background. It's really a print by Frederick Remington, who was in the U.S. Cavalry as an officer, and it's of a U.S. Cavalry raid on Indian territory. Now, this is hung in a school that has Native Americans and Black American children in it. It's hung on the wall. In the foreground, the picture touts the transformative assimilationism of, by establishing what would seem to be kind of an unbridgeable gap between the students who are there now in their uniforms, Black as well as Native American students, you see the teacher there as well, and the noble savage Indian who is put on display. That's the past. And so when Native American children can look at an Indian as an illustrative object in a history lesson, then the process of cultural alienation would seem to be complete. Out of time, that Indian has become the display object of what anthropologist Renato Rosaldo has so insightfully called imperialist nostalgia, the conqueror's nostalgia for what he has destroyed. It's mind-boggling irony that this is a nostalgia that the Indian children in the class are themselves enjoined to share. Francis Johnson's brilliantly staged before and after photo was thus set up to aid assimilationist ideologists and the language of democratic belonging that would have tried to disguise the actual contradictions between citizenship training and promise on the one hand and the lack of social, political, and economic integration into the national body politic on the other. These children were never meant to be more than second-class citizens. Now, presenting Johnson's Hampton album at the 1900 Paris World's Fair as an exhibit of American success of modernity can in no way belie, as I said, the human costs, the occlusions of this transformative act. But photographs can also expose their own contradictions, and they can thus counter the myth that they have taken to serve. An example of this, let me talk about it a little bit. In 1937, E. Beverly Brown, who was a young Quaquala girl, was taken from her family and sent to St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Alert Bay, British Columbia, Canada. Canada also, by the way, sent children until very, very late to boarding schools, native children. Beverly was a second-generation student at the school. Her father had been there before her, and it was he who brought her a small camera, a small brownie camera, and with it the possibility of not just being an object of a camera gaze, but also of becoming an image maker in her own right. So the scores of photographs that she and her friends took with that little brownie camera over the next year provide a very rare record of the residential school system seen through the eyes of a student who participated in it. St. Michael's, which was in operation for nearly a century, 1879, 1874, was, as I said, a residential school for Aboriginal children in Canada. It was one of 140 such schools that Canadian law mandated Aboriginal Indigenous children to attend to satisfy the government's policy, which was unabashedly called aggressive assimilation. That's what they actually called it in their documents. The last such Canadian residential school closed in 1996, followed by a massive truth and reconciliation campaign that led to formal apologies by numerous religious orders that have been involved and by the Canadian state itself for wrongs and sufferings that were committed and inflicted on Indigenous children. Informally set up and intimately photographed from a short distance at the subject's eye level, young Beverly Brown's photographs show smiling children who seem happy to be together, exuding pleasure and a sense of community. They appear comfortable with the photographer and visibly seem to enjoy the photographic event. The relationship between the camera lens and the image's subject is visibly closer, more intimate than in photos by Francis Johnson or Nicholas Chode or any other institutional photographers, images in which the children are observed and put on display rather than directly engaged by the photographer. Recently, Beverly Brown's daughters, Bessie Brown and Pam Brown, eloquently described a collection of images their mother and close friends of her mother, because she lent the camera, took at St. Michael's. And they wrote, the daughters wrote, St. Mike's was home to Beverly for 8 years. Beverly and her brother, Peter Mason, were the second generation of the Mason family to attend St. Mike's. Their father, Peter Mason Sr., also had attended the residential school. Peter Sr. clearly understood the hardships of being away from family and friends at such a young age. In between fishing and trapping, Peter would make time to visit his children in Alert Bay. It was during one of these visits that he gave Beverly a Kodak camera. The camera became a passion for Beverly and her friends. Wherever they went, they took the camera along. Beverly's father generously ensured they had enough film to take as many photos as they wanted. Peter would then send the film to Vancouver to be developed. The photos in Beverly's collection provide a unique lens into the lives of students at St. Mike's. The young photographer snapped most of the images out of the sight of St. Mike's staff and away from the confines of the school. Their photos give voice to students who were often silenced or invisible. They're a testament to the strength and courage of the girls and boys who attended Indian residential schools and whose friendships became lifelines for one another. The photo collection is not meant to extol the virtues of St. Mike's or to justify the wrongdoings that have been publicly documented. Rather, it pays tribute to the resilience, spirits, and strength of these students. End of quote. As Bessie and Pam Brown made clear, it is not that the children of St. Michael's did not suffer, it is that the photographic events themselves might have provided a hiatus in the school's routine, a respite from institutional surveillance, offering the children a chance to become agents of their own representation. Brown's camera provided an alternative, in Bell Hook's terms, an oppositional view. She shows us that exceeding the institutional gazes that shape them, school photos can, even in such troubled times, become individual and communal documents reflecting both resistance to violence and the memorialization of its victims. They thus point to the possibilities for a different form of citizenship in the future. Well, these are precisely the complexities we find in a second set of photographs we want to discuss today, images taken of Jewish school children in Nazi-occupied Holocaust Europe. Let us first mention that a staggering reality frames any discussion of Jewish children, schooling, and photography during the years of the Holocaust. Only approximately 11% of the 1.6 million Jewish children under 16 who were alive in 1939-1940 in what became Nazi-occupied Europe survived the war. For adult Jews, this survival rate was about 33%. Given the immensity of the genocidal destruction of Jews and the special targeting of young children, who for the Nazis were the seedlings of potential Jewish future and potential revenge, it may perhaps seem odd that some officially Nazi-sanctioned schooling continued to exist for Jewish children during the early war years on an on-again, off-again basis. But even when classes were officially outlawed, Jewish teachers and adults in the ghettos set up clandestine schools and held makeshift secret underground classes. In July 1940, Miriam Wattenberg, who became Mary Berg, she managed to survive and write a memoir of the Warsaw Ghetto. She was a teenager. She noted in her diary, and we have her diary, there are now a great number of illegal schools, and they're multiplying every day. People are studying in attics and cellars, and every subject is included in the curriculum, even Latin and Greek. 2 such schools were discovered by the Germans sometime in June. Later, we heard that the teachers were shot on the spot, and that the pupils had been sent to a concentration camp near Lublin. For ghetto inmates, the efforts to teach children and to provide them with at least some of the daily routine of schooling reflected an impulse to render a sense of normality and ordinariness to extraordinary times. Enveloped by utter dehumanization and threatened with annihilation, many of the ghetto teachers relied on personal as well as in social and cultural memory to recall and transmit knowledge and values associated with a liberal humanism and cosmopolitanism that the Nazis were determined to obliterate. Refusing to give up hope that a time would come in which Nazi Germany would be defeated, they taught subjects and imagined futures, if not for themselves, then for their pupils, that reflected their own humanistic education and upbringing. Among these teachers, undoubtedly, were those who wished to believe and wanted the students to believe that despite the everyday evidence to the contrary, a world would again come into being in which Jews would be accepted and integrated. Of course, a large number of images of Jews in ghettos and camps, including some of school classes, were taken by perpetrators to further Nazi propaganda aims. Some were certainly intended to stir up anti-Jewish hatred by depicting Jews as subhuman and degenerate, as this photo of Jewish children in an unspecified ghetto location, published in 1942 in the Nazi weekly tabloid Der Stürmer, attempts to do. Others were taken to show or to feign a kind of normalcy. And yet, despite the fact that they are shaped by a Nazi gaze that attempts to strip its subjects of their personhood, even these perpetrator images embed within them small acts of resistance and assertiveness on the part of their subjects. Subliminally, we would argue, even perpetrator images register contingent details that permit us to see beyond the Nazi visual field. Let me elaborate on this very briefly by focusing on 3 ghetto school photos that illustrate precisely this gaze and the possibilities of circumventing it. The first 2, taken moments apart, present children outside a building that may have been a school in the Lodz ghetto waiting to receive food. The third was taken indoors in a large vocational class instructing students in the fabrication of leather products, also in Lodz. The 3 photos, part of a trove of over 600 transparent color slides documenting the workings of the Lodz ghetto from 1940 to 1944, were taken by Walter Genevine, who was the chief accountant of the Lodz ghetto, a member of the Nazi Party, and a skilled amateur photographer privileged with access to a high-grade camera and extremely difficult to acquire IG Farben ACFA, became ACFA, color stock and processing. Although not precisely dated, it appears that the images were taken at least 1 year apart. The first, perhaps in the spring or summer of 1941, and the second, sometimes in the latter part of 1942. The smiles on some of these sun-laden children's faces in the first two images in such a viewing shadowed not only by the Jew star the children display and by their gaunt, impoverished appearance, but also by our knowledge that all officially sanctioned ghetto schools in Łódź, other than specialized vocational ones, were closed down by the Nazis in October 1941, and that most of these children were slated to be killed not long after being photographed. Looking more closely at the image itself, however, we see something else. We see that some of the boys stare back directly and unsmilingly at the photographer, and by extension, at us as viewers of this photo. And in so doing, they take an artful command of the experience of being photographed. In seemingly refusing to comply with which may have been Genevine's efforts to order and group them into a lineup of compliant Jewish ghetto children and to objectify them for display and propaganda, the three boys at the center willfully withhold acquiescence, return the look by staring back at the camera, and sternly subvert the monolithic power of the Nazi photographer's organizing gaze. The third Łódź ghetto photo, taken some month later in a vocational classroom, further underscores the link between perpetrator photography and the Nazi killing machine. By the time it was taken in mid-1942, after the Wannsee Conference to coordinate the implementation of the final solution, the Nazis had begun mass deportations from Łódź to nearby Chełmno, where by the end of May of that year, over 55,000 Jewish victims were asphyxiated in gas vans. Children under 10, old folk, the infirm and the incapacitated, persons least able to perform the forced labor that the Nazis demanded for their war machine, were the most likely to be selected for deportation and death. The knowledge that unser einziger Weg ist Arbeit, our only course is work, as the Łódź Ghetto Jewish Council head Chaim Rumkowski declared in the aftermath of these mass transports, makes the second image of young boys and girls learning leather work especially heartrending. Within it, in the faces and eyes of the young apprentices, we can discern apprehension and dread, intensified most certainly by the intimidating presence of the photographer, Genevine, a high-ranking Nazi ghetto official, in a class where laboring competence was being scrutinized. And yet, does not even this perpetrator photo, shaped by a Nazi gaze, carry additional gestures and meanings within it? As a school photo, does it not also testify to the practice of collectivity and the defiant will to continuity and survival inherent in the very practice of teaching and learning?
So of course it's also important to stress that it wasn't only Nazi photographers who took the images in the ghettos. Many of these images were taken by Jewish photographers, and they fall into two types. One is our images like this one, which were taken by sanctioned photographers who were working for the Jewish councils, who therefore had film and developing potential. But this one, for example, were taken sanctioned photographs that in Łódź, for example, the ghetto elder Chaim Rumkowski used his cadre of photographers for propaganda purposes to show how well educated, how necessary the Jews of the ghetto were. But then some of these photographers, and also photographers who were members of the underground, also took clandestine images in many, many ghettos. In Mielec, in Kovno, in Łódź, and other ghettos. These were meant to ensure that a record of a population targeted for destruction be made and left for viewing at a future time. And I think the group photos from these other ghettos are remarkably different from the images, for example, taken by Walter Genevine. What we see here are also groups of children that are lined up, who squint into the sun and whose group photo is taken. But here, As in Beverly Brown's photo, we see children who are smiling, who hold each other, who display their affiliation and their recognition of and collaboration with the photographer. There's a kind of comfort level that I think we can detect. But many of the photos emerging from the ghetto, many of the clandestine photos, also betray the risks that were undertaken by their makers. And I think these pictures from the Kovno ghetto that depict a school that was established by a teacher and member of the underground, Shmuel Rosenthal, are very good examples. They're taken in a tight space, the lighting is inadequate, they all underscore the clandestine character of the school. As images taken by the underground resistance, of course they're also propaganda images, possibly staged ones, but they treat the children with such seriousness, they're so close in their relationship to the children. They show the earnestness in concentration of these kids, and therefore kind of attest to the life-affirming role that schooling came to play in moments of helplessness and despair, and to the length to which adults went to ensure that children could learn in such dire circumstances. As these photos show, in response to utter dehumanization, these photographers embraced the children in a group identity, in an affirmation of continuity that was made all the more precious in the context of the violent destruction to which they were subject. So let me now turn briefly to the third example of photography in concentration, in images of concentration, and these are images from the US concentration camps for Japanese Americans. Like in Nazi-occupied Europe and around the very, very same time, in the United States, photography also played an important role in Japanese Americans' forced removal and incarceration. Yet, as Jasmine Olinder, who wrote a wonderful book about this, emphasizes in her book Moving Images, and I quote, "While Holocaust photographs stress the extraordinary nature of the concentration camp, Japanese American photographs seem to portray the concentration camp as somehow normal. It's much more difficult to find photographs that portray suffering than it is to find smiling faces." And there's a whole discussion about the smiles that is very interesting that we could talk about later. The images that have survived the US camps have thus been at cross purposes with post-war critical historical accounts and indictments of the cruel injustices perpetrated by the US government. The bulk of photos of these US camps were taken between 1942 and 1945, were produced for the federal government by official photographers working for RAPS, the War Relocation Authority's photographic section. Initially, in 1942 and 43, following the implementation of the executive order, the WRA hired professional photographers including Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, whose images you can see here, and Russell Lee, who had photographed for the Farm Security Administration during the Great Depression years of the 1930s. At the very same time, however, the WRA outlawed the use of cameras among incarcerated Japanese Americans, so very much the same kind of procedure. Although at least one Japanese American photographer, Toyo Miyatake, smuggled his cameras in and courageously documented the incarceration clandestinely. The employment of photographers who were known to be politically progressive implies that officials hoped that this archive would counter allegations of mistreatment and show that the displaced and interned, in the terminology of the time, were being treated in an orderly and humane manner in keeping with standards of international law. And some photographers were actually asked specifically, or told specifically what they could show and what they couldn't show. So this is an image by Ansel Adams, who was a friend of the director of one of the relocation centers, and he asked Ansel Adams not to show barbed wire or barracks in his images. And you see that here the barracks are blanked out with a screen, with window screens, whereas here in this image you can actually see the barracks. So Adams complied in the images that he made. And the WRA eventually impounded the photos taken by Dorothea Lange, I mean really a set of amazing photos by Dorothea Lange, who considered the removal and incarceration a grave injustice, and produced photos that underscored this sentiment. The children in her images are not enjoined to sport radiant smiles, as many of the others incarcerated Japanese American subjects do in the photos. Lang shows both children and teachers passionately eager for the structural regularity of schooling, even before barracks were made that could actually have a classroom, and to create a sense of everyday life in their disrupted existence. And I think what Lang's images do so beautifully is to come as close as possible to aligning themselves with the perspective of the incarcerated subjects. And I think it's precisely through this intimacy, that one that is never intrusive, that Lang manages to include her critique. She shows these students to be just like any other American children. These are taken before the deportation.
Very shortly before.
Right before the deportations. And thereby points to the injustice they suffered. In a recent interview, George Takei echoes Lang's approach to the incongruities to schooling in these concentration camps. He says, I learned to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag with the sight of a high guard tower and machine guns pointing at us. I was too young to appreciate the irony as I recited the words, with liberty and justice for all. Restrictions on photographers, and in some places control of their work, began to soften in late 1942 in what came to be called Phase 2 of the incarceration, when the agency's directors decided that a central component of their mission was to facilitate the release of what they called loyal Japanese Americans back into the larger society while the war was still in progress, if they could pass security evaluations, if they could find a job, and if they would sign an oath to comport themselves as good Americans and avoid contact with ethnic compatriots. So photography, and especially photography of school classes and extracurricular activities, became important as a vehicle to show a viewing public the plan's progress and to convince them of its successes. These are people who can be reintegrated into society. And of course, at the very same time, the interdiction against Japanese Americans possessing cameras and taking photos was lifted, and the result was that numerous photographs, including school photos, taken by Japanese American photographers Toyo Miyatake and Jackie Wada at Manzanar, and Hikaru Carl Iwasaki and Bill Mambo at Heart Mountain, began to emerge. And here are two photos that are attributed to Jack Iwata. Both Japanese American photographers and their subjects, enjoined to demonstrate loyalty to the United States as a condition for freedom, found themselves in a bind. As Jasmina Linder explains, in this particular situation, and I quote her, smiling for the camera became charged with new meanings. Distance, critique, and subversion had to take on much more subtle, if not covert, forms. So we find resistance, for example, in this remarkable yearbook, two yearbooks from Manzanar, 1943-44 and 1944-45, with photos taken by Miyatake. The choice of the yearbook's final image, Our World, which depicts a looming guard tower photographed from a very low angle, is less subtle in its subversion. It registers it, but only at the very end of an otherwise pretty conventional yearbook. So to end, I want to come back to the protests with which we started. Because today, it's these former school children and their descendants who are rising up to protest child incarceration at the US border. As child survivor Satsuki Ina said in an interview on Democracy Now! This last summer, quote, after decades of living our lives as compliant and quiet and demonstrating and proving ourselves as good citizens, many of us have felt that it's time for us to speak out, to protest, and to resist in ways that we haven't in the past. Because we know what these children are experiencing. We know what it's like to have family separation, to suffer the long-term consequences of the trauma of being incarcerated, for some of us more than 4 or 5 years. Joined in some instances by descendants of residential school children, child survivors of the Nazi ghettos, and in many instances also African American and Latino school children. They are returning to haunt sites shaped by layers of violence and injustice. We may not be able to see the children who are presently incarcerated in media images, but what we do see might be even more important. We see the ghosts of violent pasts that these unphotographed children have awakened. By embodying their own past images with their present and future selves in liquid time, we might say, the protesters act as surrogates for the incarcerated children. They stand with them and protest on their behalf. As ghosts from a future past, they will not rest until justice can be envisioned anew. And let me just say in closing that the bottom image here is from a protest that occurred this past weekend in Tacoma, Washington, in front of a newly opened detention center for incarcerated children. This was just in Huffington Post this morning. So the protests are continuing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, in the truest sense of the word, illuminating talk. I just want to take 1 second before we start the Q&A that I want to thank the co-sponsors who made this possible, the Center for Visual Anthropology at USC, the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC, and the USC Shinzo Ido Center for Japanese Religion and Culture. So thanks a lot for our co-sponsors, and I open the floor for commentaries and questions. Do you want to take the questions yourself?
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I love this talk, it's great. And I'm kind of interested in, well, I think you use photography exclusively, correct, rather than film, because there have been so many interesting examples of film that have engaged in some of these same kinds of questions. But I guess maybe because the Japanese internment camp situation was kind of the last that we looked at, there's a wonderful example of film that was, as you say, towards the latter part, it seemed possible for Japanese Americans to begin to make their own images. But you mentioned photography. There was a filmmaker named Dave Tatsuno who had a Bell and Howell 16mm camera, and he shot 48 minutes worth of film in color, and it's quite beautiful. In 1991, Ria Tajiri made a fabulous tape, History and Memory, you know this. And she brought kind of Tatsuno's work to people's attention, and 5 years later, that material was voted into the National Film Registry. And that is where Citizen Kane and all these other important classic films of various sorts are kept or housed, and will be part of the sort of national memory. It was only the second home movie ever voted in. The first was the Zapruder tapes.
Wow.
So that tells you something. That was 1996, and so in speaking about temporality, it's so interesting to think about the different decades and how American public opinion has shifted, and the ways in which, I mean, even now in the state of California, the state assembly is thinking about apologies. You know, it's very much an ongoing and fluid situation. And I wonder if you could talk about how, if you'd given this talk 10 or 20 years ago, how different it might have been.
Well, thank you first of all for the film references. I know History and Memory, which has been written about in such fabulous ways, and of course there are examples from some of the other sites that we also have of original archival footage that is then re-elucidated and taken up in the present and shows these sort of two temporal levels, which I think occurs here too. And we didn't have a chance to talk about it as much today. And the work of artists to reframe the original images and make them kind of newly relevant and elucidate them in a different medium through still work, but also through installations that include sound, like Carrie Mae Weems's Hampton Project also. But I think the 2000s are a different moment, and we have, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago or even 5 years ago would be very different, right? Because I think we have a new urgency now to look at this material, and the reason we wanted to frame the talk with these protests and the kind of the ghosts from the past, you know, being reawakened is because we're seeing some very similar strategies of exclusion that are happening now in our midst, and we're finding ourselves to be witnesses in very different media, because we have social media, we have a burst of imagery and testimony and forms of witness, and yet there's this news blackout of these detention centers that are happening in our very midst. So the closest you can get is to the outside of the detention center in Tacoma, Washington, with these older people and their children holding protest signs rather than being able to have a view inside. So, I mean, I think it's another instance of the liquid temporality, right, that the politics have changed. We still haven't had an apology in the U.S. for what happened with Native American children. I mean, it's happened in Australia and in Canada. There have been Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. In the U.S., there's been really no acknowledgement of the wrongdoing.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to what Marianne just said is, in some ways, unfortunately, the governments are also become smarter, because they realize, I think, the effect and the influence that those photos and certainly moving images have. And so they really go and try to clamp down on it, to prevent these things from happening. I mean, the Vietnam War is an example. I mean, how photographed the Vietnam War was, and then what happens when you go to Afghanistan and to, you know, more recent battles of the clampdown on photography, and particularly photography of casualties. So, you know, that's the other side of this that is going on, and it's sad, but I think people still try to get around it, you know, but it's more difficult. Definitely more difficult.
And, you know, one of the points we wanted to make is to show that if they allowed photographs in these centers, they could still be used in such a variety of different ways. You know, they could be made to make many different points. It isn't just one.
Will you allow me a quick follow-up? Is that okay? Okay, it's just it's another film reference, and it's a film that maybe some people might be able to see, which is called The Infiltrators. I don't know if you know this film.
No.
Alex Rivera and Christina Ibarra made a film about detention centers for dreamers.
Oh.
And not this January, but the year before, 2019, it won the Audience Award at Sundance. We've shown it here at USC. And what's so fascinating about it is The Infiltrators is about people who decided to allow themselves to be arrested so they could get inside, so they could get organized. Right. Their problem was, what kind of images can you make on the inside? And so he decided to do some reenactments. So it kind of shifts back and forth between sort of documentary and fiction. And it's a really interesting instance of what, you know, the conundrum that you're describing.
It's great. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering if you could pull apart the institution of the school in all of these photos, because they have very different roles, right? They're a colonizing force for the Native Americans, but they seem to be like a set of resistance for the ghettos, and in the internment camps, it's a very complicated relationship there. So I was wondering if you could talk about how the photographs change how we might look at the school from situation to situation.
Right.
Such a great question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that is and in part, of course, the reason that we did not pull the schools apart more is the fact that it's a talk. But yes, the schools in the 19th century, early 20th century, and photography, by and large, school photography was used as a way to certify success in incorporating the students into the body politic. Right? You teach them your versions of history, your values, et cetera, and like a report card going up over years, school photos also certified over the course of years. In the ghettos, the initial photographs that were taken when schools were still allowed, and they were only allowed very briefly until the end of 1941 in most cases. They were used, as we said, for propaganda purposes by the perpetrators. They were used to show that, oh, our ghettos are not so bad, which of course is also done with the Japanese American. You know, the initial effort was to bring in photographers to show that these concentration camps are not like the concentration camps over there, right? But what happens is that that begins to be undermined, and the schools themselves, when they are no longer legal and they go underground, the function that they serve for the photographers and for those who take the photos is a complex one. On the one hand, it shows, yes, we're still here, we're still alive, but it also shows that there is a kind of continuity of hope, that there's still a possibility, some sense of future. And the schools themselves, I think, are acting that way. What are they doing? What are they educating? What's going on in these schools? Certainly, in some ways, the values that are being taught in these schools, from what evidence that we have, from testimonies, et cetera, and documents, are the values of a kind of humanistic Europe. Right, or humanistic values of the time, and those are the ones that are being challenged. You know, humanism, a sense that people can live together. All of these things are being challenged by the perpetrators. So the schools try to, the clandestine schools try to counter that.
So, you know, one of the main insights of our book, or the prompt to our book, is the insight that schooling, public schooling, officially state-sanctioned schooling, and photography arose around the very same time, in the middle of the 19th century. And these the technology of photography really was able to serve the state, or these empires that tried to colonize populations, and really underscored the work of these institutions. So the school photograph, by definition, the gaze of the school photograph is an institutional gaze, right? And it's, you know, these photos serve the institution. The very first one that we showed of the Tulare children in Washington State, I mean, the missionaries are standing in front of the children. They don't even care if all the children are visible. Really, it's very clearly, it's done by the school, for the school. But these very same technologies can also be appropriated by people who have a different mission, right? And I think this is what we're showing, then, very same technologies, but also the very same process of education. So even though what we're seeing in the boarding schools, for example, is, you know, a disciplining process that's extremely violent, the children actually then also there develop relationships and a kind of learning that becomes very valuable. So it's two-sided, really. And part of our work this year is that we also have an exhibition that we curated at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth College called School Photos and Their Afterlives, and it's in this huge gallery, and they're bringing school children into the exhibit, and it looks like these schools are, you know, the artworks are primary, but a lot of archival photos, and the docents and asked us, so how should we present these? These schools look so repressive, and it looks like such a horrible story. But of course, it's not just a horrible story. It really has, some tremendous benefits, and the hope that schooling and the love of learning is in each one of these images, actually, even in these circumstances of repression. Yes, Steve.
Maybe a little bit extending, going on of this. So there is a discussion, are we kind of replicating the oppression when we use perpetrator photographs, for example? And we displaying victims without their consent, and so this is kind of a fundamental discussion about this. And I found this very kind of illuminating. On the one hand, we can often, if we need to, and if we try, find kind of photographs taken by witnesses or by the victims themselves, but in many cases we can't. So the question is, can you elaborate more about your decision making in this regard?
I put this up. So this is the work that we have in our exhibition. You know, the Genevine images of the color images that children. So Mirta Kupferming is an Argentinian.
It's very hard to see it in the
Yeah.
slide, but yeah.
Argentinian artist who's a daughter of Auschwitz survivors. And she's an artist we know. And when we spoke to her about our exhibition, we said, wouldn't it be amazing if we could figure out a way visually to show what the children were looking at as they were looking into Genevine's camera. So she made a work with Photoshop that is actually not about Genevine, it's a tribute to Mendel Grossman. And she imagines, the only thing we see of Genevine is his lens, right? And we see the children reflected in his lens. And the other thing that's reflected in his lens, which you can't quite see, but it's in the upper right, she imagined Mendel Grossman being in the scene. Mendel Grossman is a ghetto photographer, a Jewish ghetto photographer, clandestine but also official, who took a lot of clandestine images, some through the buttonhole of his coat. He buried the negatives, and there's a tremendous record of the ghetto, of the Lodz ghetto that he produced. She imagines him in the scene taking a picture of Genevine. So you see him also reflected in Genevine's lens. So it's very difficult to show even the Francis Benjamin Johnston images of the American Indian residential schools without showing the Beverly Brown images and this return gaze. One way to do it is to think about, to put oneself somehow into the position of the subject of the images, or whatever other materials you're going to use, and try to figure out how to align yourself with the subject and not only with the gaze of the image maker, who often is using these individuals for his own or her own purposes. So, I think you're pointing to a real problem that's there in all display of these histories, having to do with the writings. Even quoting Captain Pratt is really difficult, and we've had to do a lot of work in our book to figure out how to cite these lines by at the same time distancing ourselves from them. And in our exhibit, the object then became to try to figure out how visitors could both look at the images from a distance, aligning themselves somehow with the children, but not with the gaze of the photographer, which is really hard for school photos because there's so much taken from the institutional perspective. So how to create these distances, we went to the artists for help. That was pretty much what we did,
No, that's
right?
right. And I think one of the important things that we try to do in the exhibit and as well as in the book is to really use the work of artists, because the artists are the ones who, in a sense, point out some of these problems. There's an incredible exhibit that Carrie Mae Johnson, Carrie Mae Weems did about the Hampton project. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her work, but she really took apart the whole notion of before and after. And it's extremely sarcastic, and it's a multiple big exhibit. And what she does is, yes, she shows the images, but at the same time, she takes the kind of the assumption behind the images apart, totally, through voice, through her, just the way that she uses and cites her own artwork. And this is done by artist after artist, including our own Lori Novak, who's right there, whose work has been very, very key in sort of influencing us and really showing us the way how to enter into this kind of material and to criticize the material.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the research behind this project, because acquiring some of these images, I'm interested in sort of the archival location, archival politics, because that's part of the story, the afterlives of images and the time they existed. Some of the images are official, some of them are based on resistance. Others are like Dorothea Lange, confiscated. So I'm kind of wondering like
Yeah.
what happens to access. 'Cause that's another part of where you can have archives with no cameras, no questions.
Yeah.
Well, the archives, of course, that's we've used archives all over the place. Personal archive and official archive. The main archive for Holocaust photographs that we've used were both the Yad Vashem and the U.S. Holocaust Museum, but they're also used elsewhere. And one of the things that we've really tried to do, if names exist for people who are photographed, we really tried to include the names. We felt that was very, very, very important. But they are, the archives are there, and even Dorothea Lange photos, which were under interdiction, you could, for years and years you could not access it, are now totally available. You can just go online actually and get all those photos. So the modern technology, the digital technology, has enabled us to access material that we maybe not have been able to access before. So that has made things a bit easier.
But the project is sort of broadly comparative, so, and somewhat eclectic in what we could find and how which stories we wanted to select, to use, to make the larger points. So, it's kind of an overview of a lot of different things. Archives do not, school photos are not an archival category. So even for the Holocaust Museum or Yad Vashem, you could not find, and we just tried also in the Shoah Foundation testimony, in the indexing terms, you can find images of children, you can find ghettos, but you can't find school photos, for example. So so we had to kind of try to figure out ways around that to try to find some of these images. But then also, where do school photos live? I mean, they live in people's personal albums or shoeboxes. They circulate, they're everywhere, but they're not particularly remarked or remarkable. They're so ordinary. So that was another challenge of how to take these very ordinary objects that we all have and have people pay attention. Hey, I have one of those, and it's from this very unusual moment. So, I mean, there are a lot of very, very ordinary ones, and then there are these ordinary ones that are from such extraordinary times that they actually then teach us how to look at the more ordinary ones. So yeah, it's a great question, but I don't think there's one answer. There's just, I'm sure so many things that we haven't been able to find or decode. And actually, since the book's come out and the exhibit is up, people have been sending us more really interesting images. You had a question.
Yeah, I'm trying to look over, I have many questions, but I'm trying to condense it to one. I'm not a sociologist, you have to forgive me. I'm going to ask you a very unfair question. This is just that, well, first of all, to say that it was a real pleasure to hear you present your work with the very, very haunting, I would say, images. I myself am very interested in transmission, so in that sense, I think your work is very impactful. And how do you show the transmission of something that was not there, or that is there but hasn't been fully articulated? So it's wonderful. As a human being watching this, I also wonder a little bit in the line of what you were asking, and do you feel, I mean, this may not come out of your research right now, but just a sense of, do you feel that the ways in which systems, like states still, are formulating forms or technologies of exclusion, right? We talked a little bit about that. Is that increasing, or is that just our impression because we are so exposed to all these new technologies that you were talking about? When you talk about the liquid gel and all that, I was laughing to myself because, of course, that's so many people in the room probably have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And then my thought was, do you think that these forms of exclusion are intensifying? I mean, from the sociological perspective, we claim that they are. And through the lens of this technology, what are also the forms of representing resistance or articulating different positions? Because now we have so many images, maybe too many images, I don't know. And maybe not so difficult to smuggle anymore. I don't know, right? Do you think that both these systems are proliferating too much more? Because yes, states and power systems are getting smarter and smarter, right?
Well,
And
I think that both things are happening. I think, as I said earlier, in some sense, the authorities, whatever you want to call them, governments, et cetera, are getting smarter or at least trying very hard to limit the visual, because they see that. I mean, the visual is powerful. At the same time, we also know that once you get something out there, it really can spread very fast, for good or for bad. That is the other side of it. So if they're more successful, I'm not sure. I mean, but in the U.S. right now, it is virtually impossible to get photos of children in these sites. Virtually impossible to get anything like that. But you have people standing outside who are now taking photos. When kids go out for some airing, so you begin to get to break through some of this, and the breakthrough itself, I mean, by showing that there interdictions exist, and that by showing that, I think you also begin to get people explaining why are they hiding Julian Castro? What are they doing? What's going on here? You would hope that has some kind of effect.
But are you asking whether these systems of exclusion are increasing?
no, actually, you just said I probably didn't formulate the question very well. My question was more a concern about does the proliferation of images of how systems are repressing multiple. I mean, I love the way in your pictures you reflect that it's not about particular experiences of ethnicities. They seem to be having conversations across time and across, I don't know if that's cosmopolitan counter memory or something, right? But my concern is basically the old Du Bois question. Just does the knowledge or exposure of a representation in society automatically make people resonate and respond? It seemed to me that in the past, there were a lot of responses when these images, because there were fewer images. So people resonated and it was an outcry. Do we have an outcry now? If we hear these children crying, being separated from their mothers or fathers, right? Or if we had pictures of this concentration camp we have right here in California, would we have the outcry? I mean, we do have some outcry, but I don't know, it's a question. I really don't have the answer.
No,
I
we
don't
don't
know if
either.
you have the answer either. Just
But
wanted
there
to
are
hear
images that
your
become
feeling.
iconic, right? I mean, there are a few images of child separation that have become iconic,
Yes.
right? And then you can try to figure out why and what does that and what effect did they have. And pedagogically, when you're teaching, I mean, that's really important. Your question is a really important question for all of us as pedagogues, right?
Right.
What should we be showing and what would move people? And does visual imagery still move people with this proliferation? I think that's part of the question you're asking.
Yeah, this is the $1 billion question.
Yeah. Joe?
This is a simple question, but I've noticed in the images that the girl did with the brownie candy that her father gave
Yeah.
her, it seemed like there was text scribbled
yeah.
on all of those, and I wondered whose, and at what level, temporal level
When
does
she
that mark?
wrote those,
Yeah,
pull
that's
those
a
up.
great question. I mean, one of the things that she did is that she really tried very hard, I guess, to identify everybody who in the photo. So everybody in the photo has a name. And you know, as Lois pointed out, many photos, you don't have identification. You don't know who.
And
But
was
she
this like
really
years
tried to
later, do you
make
think?
that.
Or-
She did them much, recently. There's been
Okay.
part of the Truth and Reconciliation. There have been exhibits of that included her work, and she became an activist. And then her daughters wrote this text actually for our exhibit, and allowed us to. They're very strict about who's allowed to use her images because they really want to know how they're going to be used. So they're very aware of the power of this kind of self-representation. But then what she did is write everybody's name quite recently, I think, on the
But
photos.
that fits so nicely with your argument that afterlives can remake the image by
Right.
your giving back
Yeah.
agency just through the name and what you.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
they're amazing. And they're a pretty amazing record because there are very few images like that.
Mm.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.